Oh, what a tragedy.
As you'll soon figure out, this video has little to no structure, so why don't we go straight from a lighthearted skit-type intro to a hard-hitting discussion on the negative repercussions of the media's coverage of tragic events. Specifically, we're going to discuss mass shootings, since those are the most recent and impactful examples today. Since these transitions are already so smooth, Parkland? The coverage of the Parkland shooting was highly problematic, and this has nothing to do with political views. The main focus of the news coverage seemed to be directed toward the 19-year-old attacker, Nicholas Cruz, and about every personal detail the media sources could get their hands on. Just speaking from personal experience, using the Snapchat news interface, the daily Washington Post channel was full of stories about Cruz, his plans, his history, his family, his motives, his school life, just about everything they could find. Even a quick Google search today reveals the same thing, with articles as recent as June 11th detailing the life of the perpetrator before the attacks, and, in this case, how it could have been improved, in a very apologetic sense. One of the top results on all of the search engines we tried was a Washington Post article from only a day after the tragic event, titled "Florida Shooting Suspect Nicholas Cruz, Guns, Depression, and a Life in Trouble," shows much of what was wrong. Presumably to incite more interaction with their article, the goal of most news sources, the article more than lived up to its title, portraying the horrors of Cruz's childhood in painstaking detail. The authors discussed the death of his adopted father, his obsession with guns, his troubling school history, his relationships with other students, and his plans and intentions that he posted on social media. They also included multiple videos to further draw attention to him and make his face also recognizable. This event, and the way it was covered here, was why he became so famous so quickly. I mentioned it briefly, but more articles about him are still being written, such as the Orlando Sentinel article, "How Nicholas Cruz's Life Could Have Been Different in Parkland." As the title suggests, this article takes an apologetic take on Cruz's background, posing a hypothetical scenario in which everything went right for him, at least what was out of his control, starting the article off by attributing his horrific actions to an ineffective K-12 cultural support experience, and that he was a bullied outlier. Though this article was, as a whole, directed towards the schools in a general sense more than Cruz specifically, the use and portrayal of him both brings back the idea of infamy and notoriety, and shifts the blame away from him, a dangerous effect for those who would look into doing the same. From this coverage, the 19-year-old's infamy, as well as sympathy for him caused by articles like the latter, skyrocketed. This caused, and is still causing, many issues today. First, with that sympathy, there were reports of groups identifying with and supporting Cruz, flooding him with stacks of fan mail and love letters, along with hundreds of dollars in contributions to his commissary account. Perhaps the most troubling, out of all of this, is the message it sends to those in a similar situation, that Cruz, who had few friends in the outside world, is now being showered with attention. This provides even more motivation for those looking to follow in his footsteps, perceiving a positive outcome out of a wholly negative situation. This basic reaction and support of the bad guys isn't limited to this event though, and, as the article mentions, similar things happened with other infamous killers, largely due to the same issues, though it is certainly troubling. Even more so than the support of Cruz, the copycat attempts are the most chilling, and in the roughly 4 months since the 14th of February, there have reportedly been 17 more school shootings, based on a May 18th Courts article, which included the Santa Fe high school tragedy, but still may be a lower number than it really is. And with 17 shootings in the just over 90 days following Parkland, the rise is clearly evident, and the connection to the coverage is as well. On top of these 17 tragic events, there were several instances of people with intentions and plans to do the same. We couldn't find an exact number, but there were likely hundreds based on how many there have been just around here. This is also obstructive to that which can inspire change. The articles centering around the perpetrators dominate the reportage, which diverts attention away from the victims. Victims are the inspiration for change. They provide the motive for rectification. Reading on the life and death of victims and hearing their stories is what evokes emotional response, and is what helps us form a personal connection to these stories and people. Yet reports on the perpetrators fail to produce the same response and incentive. Reading about Cruz and his personal affairs doesn't evoke as much strong emotion.
Throughout our society, intense media coverage on tragic events tends to cause more harm than good. A prime example of this is the Columbine shooting. This event took place in 1999, yet people of our generation know the names Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold by heart. It leaves us to question why we remember the names of the perpetrators rather than those who were killed and injured. As society has learned to rebuild itself after tragedies, we still continue to let the same events happen over and over again. It's unlikely that America will ever agree on a solution. However, in the meantime, we can rely on the media to help us cope, right? Wrong. The majority of news reports focus on covering the attackers' plans and not home lives. This allows people in similar situations to believe this is a good way to express their emotions. Spreading awareness about gun violence is necessary, whatever your beliefs may be. However, going into detail on the perpetrator and then allowing this mindset to reach other young children causes havoc in a society. Not only 2 years ago, the New York Times released an article still discussing the aftermath of Columbine. As stated by the mother, Sue Klebold, of one of Columbine's shooters, "Every time I see a photograph of Dylan on the Columbine surveillance tapes, I cringe. Because every time that occurs, somewhere there is a disenfranchised individual that is using that as a blueprint." Although 18 years have passed, people have continued to follow in the footsteps of these killers. The intense media coverage of the students' plans eventually made it easier to carry out time and again, as we've seen with the most recent shooting in Texas. Not only 2 months ago, an Illinois woman was arrested for admiring the Columbine shooters. It's safe to assume that this is because the media intensely covered the plans and history of the killers, which caused this woman to believe in their ideals. Global News states, "They both deeply desired to achieve infamy and notoriety through the mass killing of others." This allows kids or anyone who is in a similar situation, aka being bullied and or harassed at school, to use this as a way to vent. Eventually, certain ideas are ingrained into our minds, whether it be enforced that everyone should expect a school shooting and be prepared as it's a common occurrence, or that this is a normal approach for anyone experiencing bullying to take. Eventually, we see Columbine spark other shootings like Sandy Hook and Parkland. The once humanitarian issue has now become political and split America in half, whether it be those who are pro-gun or anti-gun. Although we aren't getting into the political aspects and are staying impartial, we thought it was worth mentioning considering this is partially caused by media looking into Nicholas Cruz's mental health and home life along with other offenders.
How do we put a stop to this contagion of violence? As a start, we stop exposing the names of those that carry out these massacres, or at least not pointing out every detail about their life, their actions, and their plans. Instead, we should divert all attention from them and direct it towards the victims and the tragedy. The what over the who. Don't give those killers the satisfaction of infamy, and don't give those contemplating mass murder more reasoning to, with the guarantee of notoriety. If we instead look up to and celebrate the victims, especially those that died in heroic ways, it prevents a killer from reaping any benefit, while still inciting positive change and reporting events as they occurred. This wouldn't require a massive shift in the way news is covered, but it would eventually help these issues be minimized. And the effectiveness of this approach has been proven, as was witnessed in the post-shooting in Orlando. The LGBTQ+ and Orlando communities came together after this tragedy, and news sources didn't spend as much time covering the person who committed the crime, but rather on the community's triumph afterwards. The focus of the stories was almost purely on the victims and portrayed how they overcame the incident. The New York Times stated that the gay community was shaken but resilient. We can only assume this is because the LGBTQ+ community was adamant on showing how discrimination has affected them over time. If we were able to do this after every tragic event, we would ultimately become a stronger country and a more congregated civilization.
See, we didn't want to end this video on a bad note because this can be fixed. What's the point of only pointing out all of the negatives, right?